welcome again to all of you. Thank you so much for coming today. We're really excited to host this session with you guys. I've already had a chance to quickly chat with most of you with our natural capital uptake pathway, and maybe I'll start with some quick reflection on this. So it's quite interesting to see there's different levels at which you put yourself in terms of your experience in working with nature and your clients. So hopefully today we can help you and with some helpful tools and resources you'll be able to go away with and help us boost the work of bringing companies along that uptake pathway around nature. But what this also shows is that a lot of you guys seem to already be doing quite a lot on that level with your organization and your clients. So please feel free also to share your experience today. We're also here to learn from you guys. So obviously we're not here today to teach you about nature or natural capital. I've been hearing a lot of different words, biodiversity, etc. I'll just clarify as of today that we're going to be referring it to as natural capital specifically. And obviously we're not here to teach you about this topic today. We're really going to be trying to walk you through the work we've been doing to train others, businesses specifically, around the topic. And we'll be giving you tips as we go through the training. But obviously, if you have any questions on the content side of things, please don't hesitate. So before we do get in, quick words about actually who the We Buy Nature campaign is. So the We Buy Nature campaign is a 3-year campaign that has been funded by the Horizon 2020 grant. We've received a bit over 2 million euros for this project. We have now gone through the first year of the project, and it will end in October 2021. So we still have a bit more than a year and a half to go to. The main aim really of the campaign is to increase business uptake of natural capital in their decision-making processes. And for that, we do several things. One of them is very much about sharing as much as we can in terms of knowledge, resources, tools, and best practices. And we'll have a chance to explore a bit of some things that you can use there on that. Obviously, if we want to help businesses, move forward on their natural capital journey, we need to also understand what are the key barriers and challenges that they're going through and how we can help them overcome these. So we're also doing a lot of work on that level. And then today is a perfect example on some of the practical support that we also do to help. So today is a trainer, but as Angelina mentioned, we also did a business training yesterday with a few businesses in the rooms, and we are also working towards doing online trainings soon. And we also do other things like help desk calls, webinars, etc. And then finally, I think one of the key elements of the campaign is that we're really boosting the work at the Natural Capital Coalition through this campaign. So we're working with the team there very closely as well. And just to note also that we actually now refer to the Natural Capital Coalition as the Capitals Coalition. As you may know, they've recently come together, the Natural Capital Coalition and the Social and Human Capital Coalition, to form the Capitals Coalition, also as a way to send a message that actually now we need to really adopt an integrated approach, and whatever we speak about natural capital, we're also speaking about social and human capital as well, which has already been mentioned today. We're several partners in this campaign. We have the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, who's the coordinator behind this project. There's us, WBCSD, obviously, that we represented today, and I do highlight that it's a luxury that you have 3 of us today, so do take that opportunity to ask questions and talk with each one of us. And so as WBCSD, as I briefly mentioned before, we're really leading all of the capacity building efforts, so very much on the practical support side of things. We have IUCN, and IUCN is very much involved, especially on the identifying barriers and opportunities side of things. And finally, OPLA is a small communications and consulting firm based in Manchester that's really helping us on the communication side of things. So that's the team behind the campaign. So today's objectives, as I've already mentioned briefly, it's really going to be about walking you through the training we've done. What we're going to be doing today is walking you through the full day training that we've developed. You'll see that we have different timings and ways you can adapt the training, but for you to really have the full overview of what you can actually do, we're going to carry you through the full day one. We're going to share all sorts of different exercises, case studies, games, etc. And again, we're going to try and really give you tips also on how you can adapt some of those specifically to your own context. Finally, we're going to be sharing tips, but of course, again, I'll share right now the fact that we also hope that you will share tips with us. So what you'll see is on the table you have post-its. So what I suggest doing is, as soon as you have any suggestion, feedback that comes to your mind, please write those down on the post-it. And what we'll do is that we'll plan on some time at the end for you, or if you also wish to share on the moment, we can also do that. But the idea is that we can collect all of your feedback and suggestions, and hopefully try and integrate some of those as well. So really be proactive as well in wanting to share anything that you wish. So this is our agenda for today, on which we're already running a bit late, so we'll try to be effective. I normally have a Swiss bell with me, but not today, so we'll try and still stick to the Swiss time if we can. So I'll start myself with presenting a bit the background work that was involved in developing the We Value Nature training. And then my colleague Johanna will walk you guys through the first part of the training, which is very much about what is natural capital and why it's important. We'll then have a fun game that we'll play or anything like that. I know people always get when I mention the word game. It's not going to be anything like that, but you'll see it'll be very interesting. And then we'll take a few minutes to have a coffee break before my colleague Matt then walks you through the second part of the training, which will be really going more into the actual practical tools, resources, and approaches that you can share with others. Finally, I'll end the training with the key takeaways and wrap up. And then if all goes well, I'm not sure about that, but we may have time for extra networking time. We'll see about that. So with no further ado, I'll just add one more thing. So you should all have with you today a participant workbook. Do you guys all have one? Perfect. So this will be an important resource for you today. This is something we also always provide businesses when we do a business training. And the reason we've put a lot of time and effort in developing this participant workbook is because one of the main elements when you look into adult learning theory is that there's different ways that adults learn. There's the need for and I also encourage you today to take notes as we go through the training. You'll see that many of the slides that we'll be going through today have been included in here, so you can easily take notes as well on some of the tips we'll be sharing directly in there. And then the idea is also that you can understand the function of that workbook, so that if you were to also do a We Value Nature training in the future, you would actually know how to best use this tool. And finally, it's also going to be important today because some of the games and exercises we'll be doing will require you to use the workbook. I've already mentioned this. Please feel free to ask questions, participate whenever you feel like it. So I'm going to just quickly introduce you now into the actual development process of the We Value Nature training. So the first thing I'll mention is that the training we're going to be looking into today is our Module 1 introductory module. This means it's a very basic introduction into what natural capital is, why it's important for businesses, and how businesses can actually start familiarizing themselves with some of the key approaches and tools that they can use. So today is not going to be about going into the nitty-gritty technical details on how you actually conduct an assessment, how do you do monetary evaluation, etc. Even though we are going to have some introduction to evaluation and measurement, but that's not the aim of this module, and that's a really important thing to note, because this is really with the idea of targeting businesses that are still at the beginning of this topic, still trying to grasp what it actually means and how they can get started. So that's very important for you to get into that mindset when we're going through this training. We are going to be starting to develop very soon, actually, our Module 2 training, which will go towards the progressive step, and I'll actually walk through that on another slide. But just a quick word on the development process of this first module. So it was quite an extensive development process that went through several months. I had a lot of chance to be able to actually collaborate with the 5 companies you see here on the slide, who directly inputted into the training material, but actually also tested the training material within their company itself. So they actually tried the training with their finance department, HR department, environmental department, etc. So that was extremely helpful in us ensuring that what we've developed is relevant to businesses and useful to them. So that was a really important step for us in ensuring that we have that business relevance. We also had the University of Geneva and a group of master's students there that helped us really take some time, and actually before we even started developing the training, conducting a sort of landscape desktop research to understand what's the existing trainings out there, what is already being done in terms of nature, natural capital, what seems to be working well, but what can we also try and improve through this training. And I'd say one of the main things we really try to incorporate in here is trying to be as interactive as possible, and that's something we'll also encourage you guys to do. I think we need to really try and move away from traditional learning formats where you have speakers that speak the whole time and then a bit of interaction at the end. So you'll see here that we've really tried to develop in a way that, again, adapting to the way that adults learn, trying to have a whole set of variety of learning methods in there. And finally, we have also a We Value Nature advisory board, on which we have several, more than 12 experts actually, that are really working specifically on the topic of natural capital, who have also inputted into the whole review process of the training material. So just to say that what you're going to be seeing today, that a lot of work and effort has been put into it. We're not saying it's the best and most perfect training, but we're saying that it is of quality and that we're happy with what we have today. And again, I'm sure there's many other things that you could still improve with it, but so far the feedback we've received has been very positive. And yeah, again, we're happy, very excited to share this with you today. So I was starting to say very briefly that today we're going to be going through the Module 1 training. This is just to show you that the progressive approach we're hoping to adopt. As I mentioned, we're going to be starting the Module 2 development soon, actually as of next week. And the Module 2 training will really be the next logical step into the training. And so we're really trying to actually follow this uptake pathway we've developed, with the idea that you need to really understand the different steps at which a company typically has to go through before you actually get to a natural capital assessment. And so the first step is obviously actually understanding the topic and providing them that basic knowledge that we're going to be seeing today. And then the next step is actually about giving some of those initial very practical tools and knowledge that they can take to start a first natural capital assessment. So the Module 2 training will be going much more into the details of how do you assess your impacts and dependencies, what it means to measure and value natural capital. It will provide a bit more of the technical insights into that. And then as we progress, we'll be looking into doing more and more technical trainings on the measurement and evaluation side more specifically. Very important thing on which I'll take a bit of time today to explain is our Creative Commons license. So We Value Nature is a project that is under what we call a Creative Commons license, which means that everything you're going to be seeing today and receiving after this training can be freely used and accessed. There's an additional advantage to you guys in here that we've also decided as a We Value Nature campaign to enable people to actually adapt the content as well without actually having to go through any licensing or copyrights issues. So that means you're also going to be free in being able to adapt the training content that you're going to be seeing, because obviously we're aware that you have your respective regional realities and specific audience. And so we'd also like for you to be able to adapt the content to that. It does mean, however, that you need to be clear on how to appropriately attribute the material you'll be using from us. And you'll have all of the details here. Is basically about giving credit to the original authors, so We Value Nature. And you'll have some specific slides that you'll need to be using as well if you are to use the material. So this is one of them that we'll ask you to include. Again, you'll have everything explained in detail also on our website, which I'll show later. But this is one of the key elements that you have to include. And here is where you have the reference to the Creative Commons license that I've just explained. So these are the 3 slides so if say you were to use a slide deck and you may adapt some of it, these are typically the 3 slides you would have to use. So we would ask you to this slide to sort of recognize the partners that were involved in the training development, the explanation around the Creative Commons license and very basically how it works. And then again, just a recognition that it's a campaign that's supporting the Natural Capital Coalition. So it's very straightforward. It's not complicated. You don't have to worry about any, again, copyright licenses, but you do need to make sure that you appropriately attribute. And then finally, we're also really keen on you sharing with us however you may adapt the training. So if you may decide in a few months to actually provide a natural capital training and that you use some of the material but also adapt it, we'd be really keen for you to share with us how that went. How did you adapt that training? Because that's something we can also share with others that can also learn from you. And you'll see at the back of your workbook, you don't need to go through it now, but I'll ask you to go through it eventually at the end of the training. We've set out a training expectations sheet just so that you can also understand how you can help us track however you're reaching businesses as well and helping them better understand natural capital. So that's sort of our, in contributing to you today, that's sort of the exchange we're hoping to get from you afterwards as well, as sort of let us know however you're using it. And we're also always very happy to see how we can support you in any training you're hoping to do. So this is the sheet I just mentioned, which you should all have at the back of your workbook. And so I'm going to now quite quickly show you, so that you're also lucky today, in addition to having 3 people, we've also now just launched our We Value Nature training resources page last week. So I'm actually now going to quickly walk you through that page so that you can see what it actually looks like. So this is the page that we've now launched with the idea of actually incorporating onto our website all of the resources that we are developing in the context of this training. So what you'll see here is you'll find again all of the explanations around the how to attribute and what the Commons Attribution License is about. And you will now see here, this is the module 1 that we're going to be going through today. And what you see here is we've adapted all of the training materials. So that is facilitator agenda, participant agenda, the workbook you have today, speaking notes, and slide deck to different timings. So obviously today we're going to go through the full day training for you to see everything, but you may not always have the chance to have a full day training. So what we did is actually adapt all of that content into these different timings. So you can download all of them according to 1 hour format, 2 hours, half day, full day. And then you'll also have a other useful resources tab, which we're also continuing to work on, where you have other useful sort of elements that we tend to use in the training as well. So this will be a really useful website to you guys, hopefully. And what you can also use to help you is our We Value Nature media library. And here what we've done is we've included a whole set of product types, if you like. So we have images, videos, infographics, and you have also, again, all of the training material here. And the idea is to really, again, this is all freely accessible. And the idea is to really provide people like you today with a whole set of useful resources that we found along the way that you can also try and incorporate in engagements whatsoever, whether it's a training or elsewhere. So I also highly encourage you guys to have a look at this this web page. So it's just so that you know that everything that we're going to be seeing today, you basically have it on our website. So you're lucky that you're going to actually have a more detailed walkthrough on how it actually all works. And yes, now I can hand over to Johanna. Perfect. So Johanna will walk us through now the first part of the training.
Yes, thank you, Katja. So we'll go slide by slide, but I won't necessarily present actually. I'll present more of the idea and the ethos behind the slide than actually what is on the slide. But don't hesitate to actually question if there's any aspects unsure. So we start the day always with the objectives, and this training, as Katja already alluded on, so there's 3 objectives. Demonstrate the understanding of natural capital, so really the basics, and its linkages with business decision making and risk management, so showing kind of the case study also behind it and why businesses should actually care. Then identify natural capital impacts and dependencies, as well as risks and opportunities, and how these relate to their own business context, so also make that applicable to them. Then the third one is be familiar with the few key approaches and tools to integrating natural capital into business decision making. So Matt will cover that part as well. and really looking at what kind of tools or resources they can use to get also started and know the landscape of it. So here's an example agenda, but as Katja said many times, do feel free to adapt it as what your audience would look like, also the gaming structure as well. So this is just an example of it. So then we go through with the audience the training material. So we always have it printed out, as Katja was talking about, to ensure also that people can write in it, that they have something concrete as well. All of these are available on the website. We usually bring the participant workbook and also some copies of the Natural Capital Protocol, but also available online if you don't have these printed out, the Natural Capital Protocol printed out. Then we use tools also for the interaction part. So we use Mentimeter. Are all of you familiar with it? So it's an online tool. Very easy to participants use just with their phone. So usually go to www.menti.com, then they just have to enter the code that you built with the website, and then it's really a simple user-friendly way to answer some questions that you put up, and I'll go through some examples that the kind of questions that we have been asking. So this is the first one that we start off with Menti. There's also other tools online like Polev, so Poll Everything. So Menti is just one of the that we've seen that works quite well. So this is a question that we usually use to kick off. We also actually come to the same question at the end of the training to see kind of how people have experienced the whole day. So it's how much do you know about natural capital? And the options are strongly disagree and strongly agree with I understand the concept, I understand my business's environmental related risks and opportunities, and I know examples of actions I can take to integrate natural capital into decision making. Some of these aspects have been already kind of covered in this part. We do this exercise also at the beginning of the full day training as we did with you guys. But it's always really interesting. Yesterday's training, for example, with businesses, they were quite in the middle, and it really also shows what can we also emphasize during the full day training or the trainings. Then we do introductions. People usually, as I can imagine you guys as well, really appreciate to know who's in the room and how to then maybe get to share some examples and networking during also the coffee breaks and such. Then, this is just an example of how we kick off the introductions. It's a good way to ground, because many people do have concepts of what natural capital, what biodiversity, what nature means. So we use this to actually ground the introductions also to a more personal view, because there are these concepts within people. So the first question we ask is, what does nature represent to you in your private life? And then what ways do you feel the image relates to your business? And here we have, so the image refers to, we usually have images of nature around the table, so people can pick one and then answer that question as well. But do feel free, if you want to adapt to your audience any kind of other introductory questions or even games or whatnot that might feel appropriate for that audience. Then we go to introduction to natural capital, so the concept of it. But here we don't do the very traditional way of just giving the definition, because as I alluded, there already a lot of people do have a concept of nature and what natural capital is, even if they might not know the very theoretical definition of it. So we actually start off with a video, and there's a link to the also different videos that you can use, and all the material is available. And this video, actually, it's a short, a bit over a 1-minute video where a CEO is confronted by staff that say that there's a risk coming up, especially on the environmental side. And also there's an investor questioning, what are you doing about this? But unfortunately, priorities, he's busy, there's other aspects to focus on. he doesn't appropriate enough time for it and actually kind of dismisses it, and then the risk actually happens. So it's kind of an introduction also to the concept of limited resources, limited prioritization aspects. And then after that,
can you find these links now?
These links, so they're available online, and also you'll be able to from the slides as well. Yes, they're on YouTube. And
These are yours, or not?
yes,
Videos.
yes, they're ours. Then we go through actually a hypothetical example where the people start reflecting also internally on what do impacts and dependencies mean. So we have an example of an agribusiness producing crops such as oranges, but depending on your audience, you can use this, or then if it's a whole forest audience, maybe use that, or then maybe able to also distance the audience from the material if you want to use another sector than actually their sector. And then they go through what could be your impacts on nature and what could be your dependencies on nature. So sometimes we get people to write it down, but also discuss in pairs. So it's just kind of an introductory warm-up part as well. And after people have done this, then we go to the actual definition that's found in the Natural Capital Protocol. So here, the definition that we use is natural capital is the stock of renewable and non-renewable natural resources like plants, water, that combine to yield a flow of services to people. So once again, we've talked a lot about how it's related to people and social capital as well. In turn, these flows provide value to business and society. And here a lot of questions, and we use it also interpretively, is that where does biodiversity sit? And here it sits, so the stocks of natural capital, the biodiversity sits here.
Can I ask you a question? It comes actually before this. You talk about what we can do, but how do we ever get somebody to sit down for such a long time? Because usually when we want to say, hey, I have to tell you something and I want to tell you about this, they say, yeah, 20 minutes enough, or can we have, so how do we, because we are all consultants or we are environmental organizations, how do we find the right audience willing to sit down for full day, you say? I would say I would be happy with 2 hours. How do we get somebody around the table?
That's a very good question, and these are, as many times said, can be adapted. But I think the minimum number of hours is 2-hour training or 1 hour. 1 hour training that we have material for. But of course, please feel free to inspire from these to maybe kind of get the introductory, and hopefully then they'd be intrigued to also do the trainings, depending if it's 1 hour or a full day. This is the full day training, but yesterday we did a 3-hour one. So for example, we didn't go through this exercise yesterday. So we showed the video and then we went into the definition part.
Yeah, obviously the length of your training is very much going to depend on the audience. So often what I say is if you have finance people in the room, typically there you're gonna stick to perhaps 1 hour, just get to it and select those elements that make most sense to them. Again, here the point, as Johanna said, is we show you the full day format because we want you to be able to see the broad spectrum of things you can do, but perfectly conscious that you may not be able to do all of that. But at least you're aware of some of the elements that you can do.
You might want to emphasize specific parts a little bit more, for example, with the finance part, more maybe even the business case that is coming up now than the details after, just to get that introduction and conversation going on with different teams.
Can you just go?
Yes.
What does it say about biodiversity? Because I'm just thinking that, like, I think that in the beginning you kind of like said that now, yeah, you emphasize that we are talking about natural capital, and which is not equal to biodiversity, right? So I'm just thinking of the biodiversity is there, and I would love to see some kind of definition for biodiversity as well, just to emphasize that there are different things, the biomass and just the amount of nature is not the same as the diversity of natural.
Absolutely. And these kind of definitions, natural capital protocol, it has some aspects in the back, right? I read it a few months ago again, so.
So actually, we indeed do, at the moment where we do get the definition, we do make the distinction with the biodiversity.
Yeah.
And again, you may want to emphasize a bit more that depending on what you're trying to do. And it also comes down to the objective of your training, but obviously this is an important part where we try to emphasize that. And we usually also say that, as it's also set out into the natural capital protocol, that biodiversity is considered as an essential element of natural capital in so much that it ensures the health and stability of it as well. So again, then you can choose how much in detail you want to go into differentiating those concepts.
It is actually here.
Yeah, but
Is there a copy of the book that we can?
yes, we have them in here. We don't have enough for everyone. Unfortunately, I couldn't be just yeah.
And absolutely. And yesterday, actually, we had a case study presentation by UPM, and they talked a lot about, especially biodiversity in their business. So then after the definition part, we go into the business case. So why is natural capital important, and especially for businesses? So we start off with, we feel like humor is sometimes a good way to shake up the status quo. So yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So this aim is kind of to shake things up a bit and start those internal reflections as well, that maybe not always the status quo of thinking of what is value, but also the short term of it and stuff like that, to kind of put those ideas in people's head. But don't hesitate to also, adapt it to your audiences. There might be some also awkward moments. And then, of course, people also really like to know about the statistics behind it, especially if you're building the business case for it. So we use a lot from the IPBES global assessment report of 1 million species at risk of extinction, really going through the big brush strokes. Okay, this is the situation. And then after this, we go down into more detail about businesses aspects as well on these. So here, this is one of the most fundamental graphs in the natural capital protocol. And here, so we just explain of how does business actually and its relationship to natural capital, and the social capital side goes as well. So if you start from this top here, all businesses impact and depend upon natural capital. This relationship delivers cost and benefits back to themselves, but also to society, so the part of social and human capital as well. And these in turn lead to the risk and opportunities to the business. And this shows kind of the interconnectedness of natural capital and business and society, and that these can't be really looked at in silos. Then we go to also on the environmental and natural capital aspects to the business case on the risk landscape. So this is from the World Economic Forum. They do an annual report on the risk landscape. And here we can see this is a timeline. So they categorize risks by likelihood and impact. And in 2010, you can see most of them are economic. So granted, we're just coming after the 2008 crisis, but you can see that slowly but surely environmental really start to dominate year by year. And in 2020 in Davos, most of them are actually environmental. And this is also used a lot because it is kind of speaking to the business audiences, because it's World Economic Forum. And one could also argue that almost water crisis can be categorized also part to environmental risks. Then, so behind that graph, we also want to show that this is actually a business reality. So there are already case studies, and here you can also feel free to adapt these. Depending on your audience, you might take from the same sector as you're presenting to, or then actually completely another sector, or even based on geography, if you have Finnish cases or global cases. But just to note also, there might be some also people in the room that if their company is shown here, it might create some feelings. So be also mindful of that. So if you want to push and create the conversation, yes, fine, but also the point is it's a learning experience, and really push forward for the opportunities of it and not maybe bashing anyone. And so here we usually have a mixture of mostly natural, linked to natural capital, but also some sides related to human rights and social capital. Then here we look at more the business. Here we don't go into so much detail into business cases, but you can as well to really talk the history behind, depending on if you feel like your audience needs it. But then we go into the broad categorization of the risks, but also opportunities, because the point is to also make sure that they don't feel disencouraged, that it's only doom and gloom, but also that there's a positive sign and there's actually really good opportunities to reap. So we've categorized the risks and opportunities to operational, reputational and societal, legal risk, and financial risk. And usually here we go through some examples. So for example, and there's in the resources online, and there's links to also the WBCSD has tens of real business case studies linked to these as well. So you can maybe, if you don't have inspiration by yourself, you can go check out and choose one of those. So for example, operational risk, we use Vale's dam destruction, or then BASF, which is a chemical company. Only last year, the year before, we're in 2020, the Rhine level went so low that they actually had to decrease a lot their operating income because they couldn't transport materials. Reputation and societal risks. So here we bring out a lot, for example, well, customer needs and awareness, demanding much more of services and goods to integrate this kind of holistic value creation, including human rights, natural capital. Also talent acquisition. A lot of, especially millennials, want to work for a company that's actually aligned with their values. Then legal risks. So we've seen a lot of companies go in front of courts the past years and paying billions. In BP's obvious example. Financial risk. So this is really also translated in share price or market price value. So here's an example of a gold mining company where the share point drops 50% because they didn't get operating licenses due to the negative environmental impact that their production would have. So, but then we flip to the opportunity, so it's not all doom and gloom. So here we emphasize, for example, circularity of business, circular economy, reputational and societal opportunity. IKEA is a good example of that. Legal opportunities to be really proactive and not reactive about the regulation changes that are coming in environmental aspects, but also disclosure like TCFD. And then financial opportunities. So we're seeing actually more and more case studies of companies getting a lower cost of capital due to their ESG KPIs, key performance indicator improvements. And some example, Philips, Olam, Danone, that have also lower cost of bonds due to their ESG aspects. So yes, please, of course.
Do you have examples of these somewhere?
Yes, they're all online in the material, so you can kind of pick and choose what works for you and also your audience. And then after this information package, we aim to get businesses also to, okay, take a step back, and the individuals take a step back and reflect what this means to you. What did I just hear? How can I organize them in my head? So we ask people to go on their workbook and just individually reflect in what ways do you think your own company impacts and depends on nature, and write down 3 risks and 3 opportunities facing in the 10 years, also thinking about the long year. We usually give about 5 minutes for the participants to do it, to really also try to reflect on what it means on their application.
And in the workbook, we've also included examples of impacts and dependencies that they can help them as well if needed in terms of risk opportunities. So again, you have the reference of the pages each time.
Then after that, the self-reflection part. Apologies, we're not giving you now, but we have the game later on, so you can start playing around with this. We go back to using the mentee or the polyp, and we actually ask them to bring them out. So it's anonymous, so people feel very comfortable in sharing. And a lot of time it does create some very interesting conversations around it, because then we take time to go through it and like, oh, actually other people in the room also have the same aspect. So here with mentee, for example, the bigger the word, the more people have put the same word in. So it brings us this excellent way of starting the conversation. So we do the risks part, but also the opportunities part. And here, interesting enough, a lot of times we see the same word in both risks and opportunities, like reputational, for example. Then after that, after a bit of conversation and reflections, we bring it back to the business case. So reminding it, also grounding it into the structure of why is it important for businesses. So there's a bit of list of creates opportunities, access to finance. So kind of looking also at the concept altogether. Now, since we have the excellent expert Katja on the 2020 super year, and let you talk over these maybe.
I mean, actually, Angelina, you also already got it, that the purpose of this slide is also important for businesses to be grounded into the current context in which we are today, which is really that what we say is that there's never been a better time for you guys to actually care about this than now. There's obviously the pressure here, but there's also especially the support that's really building up for businesses at the moment. So these are just some of the initiatives that we like to highlight, that we encourage businesses to try and engage with or be attentive of. But again, this is one way of doing it. You can also highlight other initiatives that may be more coherent or make more sense for you locally. But I think what's important is to really, again, as Johanna has already highlighted, not just make it all gloomy, there's risk, but also tell them, what, this is now the time for action. And the good news is that there's different ways you can actually come together as the business community around this topic specifically. So yeah, those are just some examples.
And then we go, so to the last mentee question in this part, but also if you have other mentee questions that you want to ask your audience, please feel free to adapt. So talking about risk and opportunities a lot, then we ask actually the question after all of this, where would you place natural capital in relation to your company? So looking at risks and opportunity. Yesterday was a little bit more here, so much more positive, but sometimes it's quite also on the upper quadrant. Haven't seen so much only on the risk side, which is always good.
So usually if there's one person that situates themselves all the way on the left risk, then we're kind of keen to speak with that company more specifically and then try and see how we can help them through that. But it's also something that causes a lot of interesting conversation usually when we do this.
Now, before Katja will go through the game with you guys and you'll actually play it, is there any questions on the kind of business case parts of the training?
Do you update, you said that you have examples online, do you update the examples because like companies work with these things all the time?
So what we refer to, you'll see on a further side, we have again on WBCS's website a whole list of case studies that you can use, and also the Natural Capital Coalition. So those are usually useful resources we encourage you to go on to get more updated examples. But then if you're referring more specifically to the one where it shows some of the incidents that happened, then yeah, this is really about actually keeping up to date with some of the news and what's happening. So that definitely is a slide that you need to make sure that you fresh up on a pretty regular basis. So we've already changed this slide at least 3 times, I would say. So.
Any other questions? Yes, Rick.
This sounds really good, and I'm really glad we're doing it fast forward, because at least working with management committees and boards, they would never have a full day for this, unfortunately. So it's really good that there's a 1 hour or 2 hour chance, and I think that this is really good, and it seems that there's a lot of materials that can be used. But I think one question that I at least come across and that we need to discuss in more detail. Of course, I understand you have to skip it quickly, is the financial aspect and the shareholder value and also this connected to risk. So I think there is like, at least I would reserve more time for that.
Absolutely.
Because that's the difficult questions you always get.
Absolutely, and we see a lot, especially C-suite being interested by this aspect. And also if you have a mix of people in the room from risk managers, finance managers, then this probably needs a little bit more focus than maybe if you just had the sustainability department, for example, in the room that's interested in natural capital. And on that side, so also WBCSD has quite a few examples also related to this one. And if I can also connect to share a little bit more on that if needed.
And there's just one other comment. I've been working more more deeply with climate change, and I work with the Finnish Climate Change Panel. And I think climate change and biodiversity, natural capital, in a way they're easy, but they're very difficult. And especially when talking, what does it mean for business? So I would assume there would be more questions on, please specify more clearly what is biodiversity, what is natural capital for businesses. I'm pretty sure we'll come to that here as well. But this many people seem to need this. They want this for the world. The sort of more clearer distinction of what it is. What is climate change? What is biodiversity? What does it really mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And how are they interlinked?
Yes, exactly. And I think this is the thing with biodiversity. At the moment, the challenge is that people don't see the link yet especially to business. To climate change, it has increased a lot in the last less than 2 years because it's been out there all the time. And the same should be done now for biodiversity. And this also means that it needs to be clarified what it means.
Absolutely.
And you can see it also such a way that in some companies, as you said, that they are now investing a lot to do the climate change and taking account the climate change issues. They also say that, okay, we are already doing things. We don't have to do the biodiversity things because we are doing the climate change things. So the content and the concepts are indeed not very clear.
Yes.
And of course,
That's a very good
related to the resources we have, when we talk about the companies, we have a huge range of the companies. We have the big ones which have completely different resources to tackle these issues, but then we have the smaller ones, and they are really struggling with the very few resources what they have.
Absolutely, yes. And we get a lot of questions also how to prioritize, like, yes, I would like to work on climate change and biodiversity, but how do I also prioritize these aspects and what kind of metrics to use? Can you put it on a simple value?
I have a question related immediately to that about this concept biodiversity and natural capital. I usually talk about nature and climate change mainly. But now I start to doubt how does this natural capital fit in there, because I also came here with the idea this is mainly nature and biodiversity, and I understand from the questions that they are, but with your definitions and also with some of the solutions and the opportunities you give, basically I started, well, how does do you see climate change also as a part of your story or not of this? Because actually it's air, and if I think soils is, I don't know. Is fossil fuel a natural capital or not? It's basically this or not. And does it then relate the use of fossil fuels? Do you see this? I mean, are we making things complex? So how does that fit? I have always tried to simplify the message because I said we get 20 minutes, we get 30 minutes, so then I say nature, and then I give some stories about how nature impacts climate change and how climate change impacts nature. And I tried beforehand, as you said, to look for which company is it and where are the direct links, how do they use water, but I don't know if it's like possible in such a short time, if we get 1 hour to introduce a new concept or a difficult concept, and then I'm not seeing clearly how is climate change a part of it or not? Or do people expect me that I talk about biodiversity when I go there with the natural? Can I talk 1 hour about natural capital? I think maybe they expect them to hear a story about nature, no, and not about climate change. I don't know. It's just an open question. What should we then bring under that?
Yes, that's it's a fascinating point and very pertinent one, and especially what kind of people do you have in the room, technical and also ecosystem specialists and such. And this is what the Natural Capital Coalitions went through very robust consultation periods of how to actually then simplify this into this kind of concept with experts from all around. So for us, climate change definitely is part, and biodiversity, all linked and part of natural capital.
I was a bit inspired by one of the speeches from your, I think
Peter Backer?
Yeah, he said like, guys, simplify, simplify, simplify. Don't make things complex. And one of the things he said was, and I don't remember the three, but he said, it's about nature, it's about climate. This decade has about nature, about climate, and I think it was about human rights and about people.
Yes.
Nothing else, he says. Just focus on this. And this story like contradicts a bit with it. Lots of difficult concepts.
That's a good point, but I would argue that it doesn't contradict in itself, that it's so climate and nature is so interlinked. And we also see it a lot within the WBCSD, and like in this training, that what level, because Peter Backer, I mean, he talks to the CEOs of the world, so it's a different kind of messaging also put through, whereas this has usually the audience in the room is much more, okay, day to day, getting hands dirty with these subjects, looking at KPIs, looking at what my business can do, then actually, okay, the visionary, this is where our strategies should be linked. This is what we should be looking at, governance subjects as a CEO and the C-suite. So this is more on, usually we don't have so many CEOs in the room, sometimes though, but usually they're more, but a very good point. But for us, it's not really contradictory. It's just breaking it down even more and looking at a specific aspect of it, even if it's so very overarching and linked to the others as well. Like, I mean, people with this diagram with, I mean, this is simplifying, no, now I'm lost, simplifying it but to the links to society, human capital, social capital. But very interesting conversations. I am just with the timing, we should move on probably and pick up the conversations.
I think each time we come to the definition, there's always some debate about it. So I think there will always be debate on the definition. But it's true that the way we've also built this training is very much with the idea we need to simplify. I mean, businesses are overly confused at the moment, and coming in with 100,000 different definitions is not either, I think, the right way. So that's also one of the reasons that we've done it this way. Again, very much depends on what it is that the message you're trying to bring for it. But what I will say is that we indeed recognize the need to further enhance the interrelationship between nature, business, climate change, and all that, and it's something that we're hearing more and more. So we've actually started working on a nature infographic that kind of tries to explain these interrelationships. So hopefully we'll be able to have that infographic onto the We by Nature website pretty soon, and I can actually also put that on.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, one of the main benefits of adopting this type of approach in terms of measuring value impacts is the ability to understand impacts across a number of different areas, including impacts on people, impacts on nature. And if you're using monetization approach, which we'll go into in a little while, it's a way of getting everything in the same scale and really to kind of try to balance these different impacts.
I showed you a bit too quickly. Anyway, thanks so much, Matt, for adding on that. So I don't want to bring any frustrations, but we could. The thing is that at some point we need to stop the definition conversation, because it's the conversation that always can go on forever. But very happy to discuss further during the coffee break and afterwards. So I do want to play the game with you today, because it's important that if you do wish to use it, that you understand how it works. So what I'll ask you to do now is please open your workbooks to the pages that you see on here. And what we're going to do for this game is I'll ask you to play in groups of 3. And we'll have maybe one group of, Angelina, will you play as well? Yeah. So I think we'll have 3 groups of 3. And so here's the following instructions. So I want you to now get yourself out of your role of a consultant or whoever you are today, and now this only role play you're going to have to do is put yourself into the role of a senior management team. So you're part of a senior management team of this company called ProPNP. It's a pulp and paper company that's based in South America. I'll also just add that in addition to producing paper, we also do plastic packaging in certain cases. And what you're going to have to do today is identify your key environmental risks and implement appropriate risk responses. But for that, I'm going to give you a bit more information to help you. So basically, there's been in your region increasing issues of climate change and deforestation that have all been much more into the spotlight. And actually, there's even one of your main competitors that have recently been impacted by floods in one of its operational plants in Brazil, which has caused lots of issues for that competitor. So your CEO is kind of worried and urgently convenes you into his office and says, well, I need to absolutely avoid that this kind of situation happens to ProPNP as well. So I now convene all of you, my senior management team, to review once again our key environmental risks. And I'm also going to ask you to implement new risk mitigation measures based on that. But to add a bit more complexity, obviously, your CEO asks you also to respect its main overall objective of the company, which is to be a recognized brand in the industry that takes into account increasing demand for responsible brands and products. Okay, so your CEO is also quite impatient and does not give you much time to actually conduct that task. Here today, obviously, I'm not going to give you a few months to do it. I'm going to give you only a few minutes. So what I'm going to ask you to do is you're going to go through two very simple steps, which you have in your workbook. And so as I mentioned, you're going to go in your team through the first step, which will be about identifying the 3 top risks you believe are for your company ProPNP based on the context I've just given to you. And then in step 2, on the next page, you're going to also identify, based on those top 3 risks, which risk mitigation measures you feel are most appropriate. And again, I'll highlight, this is all keeping in mind that you need to respect also the overall objective of your company. So is everything clear in terms of instructions?
The answers are pre-given, is that?
Exactly. So you need to select from that list of risks, and yeah, and so what you can do, the simplest, is to simply circle the top 3 choices that you take. And then I'll add one more thing to this exercise, is that in your group, you also need to come to an agreement as to what is the measures that you're choosing. So what is the risk and the mitigation measures. You have to agree on them.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to move on to the next part of this exercise or game. So what I'll ask you to do now is please go on to the next page in your workbook, which includes a graph. Don't be afraid, it's going to be a very simple graph to use. So obviously you've had some time now with your senior management team to go through this issue, but in the meantime, the life continues and events happen. So what we're going to now do is, or what I'm going to do, this is my favorite part. I'm going to literally spin a wheel of events. And so we're going to test now and see how well we have done as a senior management team to address these risks. And I hope for you that whichever event we fall on is not going to impact your share price too much, because this is what's going to happen now. The graph represents the share price of your company. And depending on which event I fall on, this will either positively or negatively impact the share price. So we're going to spin just a few times. And droughts. So droughts are impacting one of ProPNP's major suppliers, and extreme weather events are impacting the ability for products to be transported around the world. Please decrease by $2 if you haven't implemented response E or F. If you have implemented one of those responses, you may increase by $1 the share price. So I'll repeat, please decrease by $2 if you haven't implemented response E or F, and decrease by $1 if you have, increase by $1 if you have.
This is usually the part of the game where we hear, I told you we need to put this response. So no fighting, please.
But no, you are, how would I say, promoting the weak policy, yeah, just by. I thought, I was going to suggest that you know the response that is far too weak, but this is not structural solution, yeah.
Well, I imagine you guys have gone down there.
Oh, yeah.
I see those down here as well. Okay.
Long-term thinking is not rewarded, yeah.
We will see. We will see. Anyone that has gone up here, or yes? Okay, we have one team that had that has gone up. All right, we'll do another spin the wheel. Hopefully, you'll be more lucky this time, or not.
Changed company.
All right. So as you may recall, I did mention at the beginning that in addition to doing paper packaging, they also do a bit of plastic packaging. Bad news for those of you that didn't take that into account, because there is now a ban on single-use plastic products that has been announced to be phased out and commencing immediately. So all companies that do plastic are having to phase out from that. So please decrease by $3 if you haven't implemented response A or H. If you have, you may increase by $2. Ah, a lot of you thought about the plastic. Good job. All right, so one more just to see if I can increase a few more of you. And by the way, don't choose which event I fall on. Huh? It's completely arbitrary. So, shareholder resolution. Shareholder resolutions have been submitted against all paper and packaging companies requesting an ESG impact specialist is appointed. If you've implemented response D, please increase by $2. If you haven't implemented response D, if you have, sorry, please increase by $1. Decrease by 2 if you haven't implemented response D, and increase by 1 if you have. So actually now is my favorite part of the game, is to know. So you have a little green bubble at the bottom that can enable you to write down what's the final share price of your company. And so now we will go through each group and see what's the final score. So let's start here. 11. So share price of 11, okay. 11 as well, okay. Can you do better? 11 as well.
11.
No way. This has never happened before. I always have winners and losers. Oh, this is boring. I should almost do one more. Yeah, so this is a very, okay. Good.
Very productive.
All right, I guess maybe that happens only when we have consultants in the room. That's never happened before.
Tweet about this. Record results with thanks to hashtag KPMG.
That could get very competitive. So anyway, the idea here is really to just further emphasize a bit of the discussions around risk and opportunities. And actually also one of the reasons we do this game is because it's a really nice way to emphasize the importance of prioritizing. Through this exercise, you were forced into prioritizing issues, right? And so that's one of the key elements, obviously, as well, when tackling natural capital, is you have to prioritize what issues are most important to you. So this is just a nice way. It also encourages discussions around the importance of materiality, what is really most important, what is less important to a company. And one thing that I did make you do was to come to an agreement as a team, which obviously adds some complexity because you can't always agree. But actually, we have a board game version of this, which is even more complex, where you're also attributed a specific role. So you may be the CEO of the company, maybe you would be the investor, sustainability. We also have an operations manager. So we didn't do it here because it would take too much time, but usually we also add that as another component, just because it's also very much the reality. You're having to consider decisions and prioritize, you have different interests that you have to deal with, and conflicting priorities as well. And that's very much what companies are facing. I mean, and also I gave you the time constraint of having to do this quickly. That's also something that we're seeing our members sometimes being very pressured with the amount of time they have to actually conduct a natural capital assessment or come with the key environmental impacts. So it's just a nice way to sort of emphasize some of these very realistic issues that companies are going through in a fun way. Again, like I said at the beginning, game is a nice way to learn as well. It's also a nice way for people to actually exchange also on opinions on certain aspects. You could hear sometimes people, arguing a bit on certain elements. So it's usually a really nice way to sort of have discussions around that. We have in total 8 different events. So today I just went through 3 of them with you, but again, depending on how much time you have, you can go through more of them or not.
We were missing the CFO who would be asking all the time, how much does this cost?
Yes. Actually, I forgot to mention another element that's added in the game, the board version, is biases. So, for example, you don't choose, you just like pull a card and you're like, okay, I'm the CEO, okay. And then you have to take another card, which is a personality bias that says, in addition to be a CEO, you are also convinced that you are always right, for example. Or you may receive the card of you are always trying to have people agree or come together on certain elements. Or you may have another bias card. And so that adds yet another complexity where people have to also play within that role. And again, it's a game, but actually it's also very much the reality. It's having to deal with these conflicting personalities and priorities, interests, etc. And that can make decision making extremely complicated, as you can certainly imagine. There you had a simplified version of it, which I hope you found useful.
And the spinning wheel is downloadable.
Yeah, you have it already. And by the way, I shall mention that it took me forever to do this spin the wheel. It used to look like a drunk version of it. It didn't used to be this pretty, so please appreciate that the effort that was behind this. So yes, everything you can use. So I'll just need to go through now the voila. Then we always emphasize the importance of having a debrief discussion after any exercise game that you do. Always take the time, if you can, to actually discuss about what it means and have, again, Johanna also mentioned before, the importance of letting businesses to actually reflect on, okay, what does that mean for me? And this is also usually a really nice opportunity for you to question your businesses on how do they manage their environmental risks? What's the process in place in their case? How involved, if you have sustainability in the room, people in the room, then you can also ask them how involved are they in the process. Very often they're not involved, which creates misalignments between the actual risks filings and those of sustainability risks. So it's again some very interesting points that you can try and have discussions with the people in the room. And usually what's interesting is that when we did this was to find a few companies saying, oh, it's interesting to hear that you're also going through that challenge of having to convince risk management that this is an issue that's important. So it's also a nice way for businesses to, it's reassuring to hear, oh, I'm not the only one that's struggling to convince in my team or that's trying to cooperate with different departments and things like that. So it breaks down the ice quite a bit as well, this debrief discussion. So there we always remind where we are into our learning objectives. It's important just to also, again, remind them of that. So just before I hand over to my colleague Matt, I forgot to mention that regarding the game, it's again something that you can quite easily adapt. So again, we gave a specific scenario of Brazil, etc., but it's something you can completely change depending on what makes the most sense to you. So you can change the region, you can change the actual issues. We chose climate change, deforestation, but again, this is something you completely adapt. So just wanted to hide that. And even if you wish to change some of the events, it's also something you can do. So yeah, now exciting part is the tools and approaches and some of the practicalities that you can undertake. And yeah, so we're lucky to have Matt, that's very much of an expert in that, who's going to carry us through this part. And just a reminder again, the point of this part is not to go into the technical details of a monetary valuation or things like that. Keep in mind the fact that we have in the room businesses that are really at the beginning. And so that's the way also that this part has been framed. So over to you, Matt.
All right. Thanks very much, Katja. So as Katja was saying, then the main objective of this part is really, because we only have a short amount of time, we can't go through how to do a natural capital assessment. You should do this, 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 and this. Instead, what we tend to do in this training is reference key tools and resources that we would recommend businesses to use in order to go about their assessments. So in terms of key resources, then the primary reference material that we would recommend is the Natural Capital Protocol, which probably some of you now have a copy of at least, but it's available online if you don't manage to grab one of the hard copies today. So the Natural Capital Protocol is a product of the Natural Capital Coalition, which is this group of around 300 different organizations from policy, from business, from academia, et cetera, and they put this together in 2016. And what it is it's quite a high-level, flexible framework. So it encompasses a broad range of other existing methodologies. So because of this, it's quite high level. You can tailor it to a specific purpose, but it doesn't necessarily tell you specifically do this, 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 and this. So it's useful to use this in conjunction with tools that are a little bit more specific. So in terms of what's in the protocol, then it's a methodology that has 4 stages and 9 steps. First step is why. So here we're talking about what is natural capital, why is it important, some of the issues that we've been talking about this morning. This is followed up by the scope step, where the guidance that's in the protocol really helps businesses to, number one, define the objective, because this process can be used for a variety of different objectives. We'll come on to some of those objectives in just a minute. We provide guidance for scoping the assessment. So here we're talking about setting the boundaries of the assessment in accordance with the particular objective. So whether this is focused on a product, whether it's an assessment of the whole company, whether it's a specific geography or part of the value chain, for example. The last part of the scope phase is really looking at impacts and dependencies. So this is around determining materiality, and it's about establishing connections between the activities of the business and how these activities result in an impact. So that's frame, that's scope. The third part of the protocol is on measurement and evaluation. So here we have step 5, which is around measurement. Step 6, which is around understanding what changes. So this is in relation to baselines. And we can talk maybe a little bit about baselines if we have time a little bit later on. But it is a particularly important issue, and it's certainly something that the companies that we work with find challenging. Step 7 is around actually valuing those impacts. And I think on the next slide or in a couple of slides time, we'll talk a little bit actually about what this means to value. A lot of the businesses that we work with as WBCSD are quite focused on monetary valuation of their impacts and or dependencies, but this isn't the only way to go about this. And then the final stage in the protocol is applying, which is particularly important because obviously the aim of doing a natural capital assessment is not to do a natural capital assessment, it's actually to do something differently as a result of this. So this stage is really about, what can we actually do with this information? How can we make decisions differently as a result? So those are the different steps and stages, the process of the protocol. And by the way, just interrupt if you have questions, comments, and we'll keep things a bit more of a discussion rather than just me talking at you guys. So the next point that I wanted to mention, so there's a few important points on this slide. Number 1 is that today we're talking about natural capital, but this goes hand in hand with the concepts of social capital and of human capital as well. So I worked pretty extensively over the past couple of years on developing the social and human capital protocol, which is a sister protocol for the natural capital protocol. It has the same steps and the same stages that we talked about on the last slide, so it can easily be used in conjunction with the natural capital protocol as well. And there's a number of reasons why this is important. So practically, at WBCSD, then we see probably around 3/4 of the companies that we work with being interested in a holistic assessment of their impacts, both on people and on nature as well. And I think this is really key to making the right decisions, is to have this fuller picture of information. So that's the first point that I wanted to make on this slide, is that the natural capital protocol comes with
also the social and human capital protocol as well. The second point I wanted to make here is that in a lot of traditional business reporting, we're talking about impacts. So in GRI reporting, et cetera, we're talking about impacts. But if we're talking about helping businesses to make better decisions, then what business depends on, and their dependency on, in this instance, ecosystem services, on the value of nature, on the value of supporting and regulatory services like climate, ecosystem services, is really, in my opinion at least, much more critical for business decision making rather than impacts, which impacts on society. So that's the second point I think it's worth making on this slide, is that we're moving from just talking about impacts to also thinking about business dependencies on nature as well. Okay. So we mentioned a minute ago that there are a variety of different business applications for this type of process. So this is a list from the Natural Capital Protocol of a number of those particular applications. So we see businesses using this kind of process to assess risks and opportunity, to compare different options, to assess impacts on different stakeholders, which is a key part of this process. We see a lot of businesses using this kind of process to estimate total value and or net impact. And we'll have a look at some of these examples in just a minute. And lastly, even though the protocol, the Natural Capital Protocol, is primarily focused on helping businesses to make better decisions, we see a lot of the businesses that we work with that are also interested in communicating this information externally as well, talking about concepts such as their true value creation, once both their negative and also their positive impacts on nature and people are also included in this as well. So after we've talked about the different types of applications, we normally have a number of different case studies of said applications. I'm not going to talk about this one, but just to say that we recommend that you include a number of different case studies that relate to these business applications. So this one, for example, is for risks and opportunities. And then this is an example that we have for comparing different options and communicating internally or externally. And I will just say a few words about this one. So this is a case study from IHC. The reason why we use this case study is a pretty good example of comparing different options where the value of nature and the value of natural capital actually should make a change in the decision. So this is a case study that compared 3 different options. Number 1 was a pristine natural forest. Number 2 was a palm oil plantation. And number 3 was a sustainably managed forest. And if we just focus on the economics, if we just focus on the short term, then which do you think of these 3 is going to be the option that's chosen the most? If we just focus on the financials, on the normal financial information. So if we just go about this in a traditional way, if we just focus on the financials, then the palm oil comes out as providing, I think it was around 700 times the economic benefits of some of the other options. It's only once we consider the value of natural capital and really make this more visible than it currently is in current financial decision making, that we actually get something slightly different. And obviously, once we think about the GHG emissions from palm oil, the land use change, the loss of biodiversity, and if we attach a value to these, then we see that this is in fact actually not the best option, and that the decision should be made differently. So this is an example of comparing different options and of the value of natural capital and how this should influence decision making. Okay, so that's a couple of different examples, different applications. We talked a little bit about the Natural Capital Protocol as being a primary resource, but we also mentioned that what's in the protocol is quite high level, it's quite flexible. It doesn't tell you exactly you need to do this, this, and this. So it should be used with tools which get a little bit more specific. Fortunately, there's a lot of different tools that are out there. On the downside, it can get a little bit confusing because there's a lot of different tools that are out there. So this is just a number of different tools that some of the businesses that we work with have used. I'll just point out a couple of these quickly. We have the Reporting Exchange, which is a WBCSD database of different reporting indicators. Excuse me. We also have the Natural Capital Protocol Toolkit and the Social and Human Capital Protocol Toolkit, which are now stored all in one go on the MIT Shift website, which is this website up here, which includes all the tools from these two toolkits, as well as a bunch of other tools as well. So what we normally do now is an exercise where we ask people to navigate the toolkit. Do we have time for this, Cassie, or no? Okay, fine. So we're not going to be navigating the toolkit today, but fortunately we have an option B. So option number 1 is to go to the URL that we see here, and we have a scenario where you're a mining company. Your senior management team would like you to explore ways to conduct a company-wide assessment of the use of water. So what we would then ask people to do is navigate to the Shift website, and bearing in mind this scenario, pick a tool which is useful for going about this. And then we have a little bit of a debrief as to what tools were chosen, why they were chosen, whether people chose the same tool or a different tool, etc., etc. But option B, if we're a little bit pressed for time, is instead of coming out of the slide deck and navigating the website, is we can talk about some of the filters that we have on the MIT Shift website and how these are useful for selecting the right tool. So in terms of the particular company, the particular sector that we're interested in, then we can navigate across different sectors. We can select mining. In terms of the boundary of the assessment being company-wide, in terms of the issue that we're particularly interested in being water, then again, we can select these from some of the navigation in the toolkit, as well as the resource type and job functions that we're interested in. So this is particularly good. Great if we have time to drop out and navigate the toolkit, which does really 2 main things. Number 1, it tells everybody how they can use the toolkit to find the tools that are most appropriate for what they need to do. It also gets people to think a little bit about the objectives of the assessment, who it's for, what's needed in terms of the boundary of the assessment, etc., etc. So that's I think that's all the content that we have in terms of recommended tools and resources. So number 1, we have the protocol, which provides this overarching framework. Number 2, you can't really use the protocol on its own. It is this overarching framework and should be used with tools which are a little bit more specific. In terms of resources for tools, then we recommend you having looking at the MIT Shift website.
And just to add on to that, nearly most of the tools that are on the MIT Shift platform are for free. So businesses wouldn't actually have to pay or go through any proprietary elements to access these tools. So that's an important element to highlight, because very often I'm always surprised of how few people and companies know about this platform, and they're always very pleasantly surprised to know that there is this wide range of tools and resources that they can actually access very easily and for free. So yeah, so it's an important point to highlight there as well.
Thanks, Katja. Did they include user ratings in the end? They did, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So another idea about the platform is that as well as looking for a particular industry, it includes user ratings, with the idea that, for example, if you're interested in water and mining, then you look at tools and you can see which tool is rated as whatever 5 stars out of 5. So
you have companies that comment as well that say, oh, I've actually tried this tool, this was the
Okay, so after talking about resources, after talking about the protocol, after talking about tools, then we generally go into presentation of case studies. Again, if we're a little bit pressed for time, then what we can actually do is merge the tools with the next part that comes after this on measuring and valuing, and skip case studies and have these at the end. I shouldn't say skip the case studies because they're really important to have. I should really say defer the case studies to the end. So in terms of case studies, we've done this in a variety of different ways. It depends on what case studies you have available, on who you may have available to come and talk about these. So previously we've done them in a carousel format where we've had 3 or 4 different companies talking about their case studies, and we can rotate around these in a small group. or if we don't have enough case studies, then we can do this in a plenary format. But we've always found that the case studies are really important because a lot of the businesses that we work with, they get an awful lot by sharing and learning with other businesses rather than us just standing up and saying, blah, 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 you need to do this, this, and this. So this is a particularly important part of the training. These are some of the issues that we encourage people to talk about with regard to the case studies. And the one that I will mention in particular is that businesses are always keen to talk about what they've achieved, which is good, but we get a lot more learning from businesses talking about their challenges and what necessarily hasn't gone 100% right first time. So we would encourage you when selecting case studies to try and encourage people to talk about these things that may have been problematic or challenging, as well as we've done this fantastic assessment, everything's gone 100% right, and these are our lovely results. Anything else that we should be talking about for case studies, Katya? No?
Have you ever made videos of some case studies? So you have
made videos, such as?
Well, I mean, things that if you say this was really a nice case study, then have you thought of adding this to your YouTube channel? As we have this other.
Yeah, so I don't think we have any case studies in video format. Katya can correct me if I'm wrong. No? Okay.
We don't, but what we are doing is actually, so we've done this training now quite a few times, and as Matt explained very well, we really emphasize the importance of having people come and present the case studies. So we've managed now to collect quite a few, and we are transforming them into stories on a 2-page format that really highlight some of those key elements that you see into the workbook. So there's actually one of them that's already available on our media library from EDP, and we have 3 more coming up as well. So I'm happy to also flag that to you guys after this training once they're available.
Yeah, we have a library of case studies on the WBCSD website as well. So if you Google Natural Capital WBCSD business examples, then we have this library of, I think it's over 50 case studies on the WBCSD website. These are quite short format case studies, so they're good for a quick example. For more detailed case studies, then probably the Natural Capital Coalition would be a good source of something a little bit more detailed.
And the link is in the site of the better.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so these are resources, these are tools, and the last part that I wanted to mention today is an introduction to actually measuring and valuing natural capital. So I said a little bit earlier that we were going to talk about what it means to measure, what it means to value. So in terms of measurement, then we define this in the protocol as determining amounts, extent, or condition in physical terms. So examples would be tons of meters cubes of water, tons of resources used. On the social side, number of injuries, number of jobs. On the environmental side, then greenhouse gas emissions. But what we aim to do in moving from measurement to valuation is really ask the question, so what? So if we're talking greenhouse gas emissions, then probably everybody in this room knows what we're talking about if we talk about tons of greenhouse gas emissions. But people outside this room, i.e. general public or CFOs or people from finance teams, likely to ask the question, what does this actually mean? What does it mean for society? What does it mean for the company? What does it mean for me? So the purpose of the valuation is to really add context to this information. So in relation to greenhouse gas emissions, then if we choose monetary valuation, then what we're looking at here is the value of these carbon emissions. So this could be the societal cost of carbon. So from a societal point of view, from a communications point of view, then this is saying what this actually means to society. If we're talking about the value to the company, then we could talk about this again in monetary terms, but we could talk about the cost of abatement to the company, or we could talk about the cost of policy that may impact monetarily carbon emissions to the company as well. So moving from the measurement to the valuation is really asking the question, so what do these numbers actually mean? What do they mean to me? And in terms of the different types of the valuation that we have in the protocol, we have 3 different types. So we see a lot of businesses that are interested in monetary valuation, but we also talk about qualitative and quantitative valuation as well. Each of which are important and each of which are suited to particular different use cases. So for example, we see businesses using monetary valuation to talk about the value of a company's presence in a particular country. And we see examples of where companies have used the monetary valuation of their presence in a country to influence government thinking, to put themselves forward as a supplier of choice for government contracts, etc., etc. So this is one instance where monetary valuation can be quite handy for companies. But this is just one instance. Of course, if we're talking about other different applications, it may be less relevant. So for qualitative valuation, then if we're talking about situating a new company facility, and if we're talking about the value of this to a local community, then we may not want to use a monetary valuation. Instead, we might want to tell a story about the value of this through extra job creation, etc. For quantitative, we see a lot of businesses that are interested in looking at distance to target in relation to some of their impacts. So these are the 3 types of valuation that we have in the protocol, with the key point being moving from measurement to valuation. Does this all make sense so far? Yeah? Okay. So from here, we normally show some of these examples of what companies that we work with as WBCSD have done. And there are 2 points that I'd like to make on this slide. Number 1 being that if we look at all these different examples and we look at how this information is presented, then what we see is that Vectorin, a French luxury goods firm that we have down here, they present this information in these dots. For BASF, it's these 3 different graphs at different points.
Just say, what are the kind of things they evaluate or they value? Kind of
yeah. Sorry, it's pretty small. So, so generally, I mean, the scope is different for different companies, but in general, then I can read out some of what these are. So I can kind of read out what some of them are. It's a little bit small. So basically, these are three assessments over the top here. So these are all for cement companies. They're all done with KPMG, with the KPMG True Value tool. And what companies generally start with is the retained benefit to shareholders. And then they look at a variety of different negative and positive impacts on society. So if we look at economic benefits, then this includes benefits from jobs, from taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, this adds to the total value creation of the company. We look at social, then, for example, this negative here is health and safety issues, which decreases it slightly. And then we have a bunch of environmental issues here as well. So for this particular one, it's greenhouse gas emissions, other emissions to air, water consumption, biodiversity, and I can't quite read the last one.
Usually with the value creation model, then there's the societal impacts as well, the value created for society. It might be direct or indirect, can be through tax footprint or main taxes, but also creating jobs for immigrants or other issues. Mm-hmm. So societal, and then of course depending on the business, social can include a lot of human rights issues in the supply chain, but then it can also include work safety or providing jobs for disabled people, for example.
The unit for all of this is like dollars or euros.
Yeah, so for these assessments, then yes. So these are generally examples of monetary impact valuation. So one of the good points about monetary impact valuation is because you can get everything in the same scale. Again, we have quite a good game developed, this one by PwC, that talks about, that emphasizes some of the benefits of monetary valuation. It talks about decision making and the fact that we have criteria for decision making in all kinds of different units. Some of these are financial information in dollars. Some of them are impact information in terms of water use in meters cubed, greenhouse gas emissions, and tons of GHGs, etc. And this can be quite difficult to make decisions. But once we think about the monetary value of all of these impacts, then we can get a net impact figure, and sometimes this helps with decision making. It certainly has its problems as well, but it has its benefits as well. So we would always advise the use of monetary evaluation with care, but it certainly has its uses, and a lot of the companies that we work with have experienced some of these benefits.
And this is the language they understand.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's always the way to open doors to the other discussions.
So this is, in terms of natural capital, then this is, in our opinion, one of these levers for actually properly influencing business decisions of finance departments and enterprise risk management and departments outside of the sustainability department, is being able to talk about the value of nature, the value of people to the company. For example, in terms of a company dependency on the social side, dependency on an engaged, trained, healthy workforce, and what it would mean to the company if this social resource was not actually there. And of course, the same applies for environmental resources.
Isn't the conclusion of all of this that there is basically no value, or there's hardly an impact? If I see these numbers, I mean, huge social, huge tax, and all the rest, the climate and the biodiversity, they're hardly visible there. As if when you quantify.
So I think this is a good point. So this is related to one of the issues that I wanted to talk about on the slide, is that we have quite a lot of flexibility in methodologies. We see companies, it's great to see companies experimenting with this type of methodology, but everybody does things slightly differently. There's no set standard for how this should work, and it's not actually possible to tell kind of how robust some of these methodologies are, and it's not possible to compare between different companies because everybody does things slightly differently. So these are all challenges that we still have to work out. If we're talking about influencing business decision making, as is the primary purpose of the protocol, then it doesn't necessarily matter what company B down the road is doing. It doesn't matter if you have the same methodology as them. And the assumption would be that if we're aiming to seriously use this information for decision making, we should use a credible approach to do so. But when we talk about communication of this type of information, then it gets a lot more complicated because we don't have these standards that say this is the right way of doing it in order to get a credible result that's comparable between different organizations. Yes.
And then again, this combined with some softer values, with the SDGs and other approaches, at least it brings an idea of the impacts and the values and the dependencies as well. But only this is, of course, slightly problematic.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And the CDP rankings, for example, how do they fit in this model? They also evaluate climate, forest, water, which is already quite a lot. How does this, is this not more comparable between companies? Or in
the CDP results?
Yeah.
CDP results are more comparable between different companies, yes, but I would say that CDP is used for something slightly different. So here we're talking primarily about internal decision making at the company, with external reporting generally kind of following on from this. And we're talking the added, doing something slightly differently is that a lot of the CDP information is measurement information in terms of tons, in terms of whatever else. But the purpose of evaluation is to kind of add that extra context in terms of what does it actually mean to people, what does it actually mean to the company. So I would say those are the two main differences, is that this is primarily focused on decision making, and that the valuation is an extra step. Also, my interpretation of CDP is that it's mostly focused on impacts, whereas a lot of this lends itself to being more focused on dependencies as well. Okay, so in the interest of time, Kathy hasn't been pointing at me and gesturing, but how are we doing?
She has her local switch.
So we have an extra hour. So in your workbooks, one of the sheets you have is this one. This is something that ideally we would ask participants to do beforehand. And what you have are a set of instructions around, I guess, evaluating the impacts of a particular company. So what we ask participants to do as part of this exercise is to take the dots that we have for low impact, the medium impact, and high impact, and put these into the grid. So on the grids, we have a number of environmental issues on the left-hand side for greenhouse gas emissions, land use change, and water pollution. And on the top, we have a number of different stages within the value chain of this fictional organization. So once participants have done this, ideally before the training, then this is when we kind of get together and look at the results of this exercise. And there's a few different reflection questions that we also ask on the back of the exercise in terms of what other stages of the value chain could be considered. If you did the exercise for your company, what would it look like? And do you think the exercise might be useful for a business to do? So once we have this information, then what we suggest doing in the training is going through this slightly bigger grid, and we can say that, in fact, what they've done was actually a qualitative impact valuation assessment in a very, very straightforward way. And this actually relates to the real impact valuation assessments of Kering, this French luxury goods manufacturer that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And this is actually what comes out of the Kering assessment. So it's quite a good opportunity to think a little bit about why we got some of the answers we did, how these are different to this assessment that was done by an actual company. Of course, this is a bit more detailed in terms of what it goes into. It has the prices, the values of the impacts on the right-hand side here. It has more stages of the value chain, and it has, of course, a much larger number of environmental issues that are considered. So
basically, this exercise is a nice way if you want to kick off discussions about what does it mean to look at impacts across the value chain. What Matt just showed is basically the actual Kering environmental profit and loss. So as you could see in the case of Kering, they actually evaluated their impacts of the different issues throughout their whole value chain. In the little exercise we have businesses do, we simplified it. We just took 3 issues, 3 parts of the value chain. And it's just, again, a nice way to kick off discussions around the whole difficulties of determining impacts across a certain number of value chain levels. Often they're quite surprised to see the actual results of Kering as well. Sometimes they think that, I don't know, for example, often they think that the biggest impact is on water pollution. But in fact, when you actually see the results, land use, I believe, is one of the big impacts. And then, yeah, exactly. So then it's quite nice for them to see, okay, interesting. How do they actually come to those results? So again, it's just a nice way to kick off discussions on some of these issues. And you can also, if you wish, actually do the admin exercise during the training as opposed to before the training. We've done it before just so that we have material that we can use to then exemplify it a bit further. But again, you can adapt that as well.
Okay, so then we have a number of questions that we would like to ask some of the participants about the Kering study. And one of the reasons we picked this particular study is because they publish all this information online in terms of the actual individual results for all kinds of different countries, all kinds of different impacts, and talk about the methodology that they use in a very open and transparent manner in order to get to these values. So feel free to change it if there's something that's more relevant, but for us, this is quite a good one to talk about. We then picked this particular area of the environmental profit and loss statement, looking at costs related to water is 38 million. And then before we actually dive into some of the Kering actual methodology and some of the information that they used, then we start to get participants to think a little bit about, how do you actually get this number of 38 million? what kind of assumptions go into this, what kind of boundaries were used in the assessments, what did they take account of when they were considering value of water, and this last one is in relation to the different types of valuation that we talked about earlier. So Karen used this monetary valuation, but would there be occasions to use other types of valuation, quantitative or qualitative valuation, and how you may go about that if you're not wanting to use a monetary valuation. And then just to wrap up the exercise that we have on Karen, then we have a little bit of information here on how Karen actually arrived at this monetary value. So by just at a very high level, they do this by looking at the costs incurred by the public due to their impact, by calculating the impact on human well-being, and assessing the environmental impact. We already talked about this one. So by identifying costs that are incurred by the public, assessing impacts on human well-being, and then putting these in terms of a monetary value. In terms of what Karen learned by doing this, as well as being quite an effective communication tool, they also use it for a variety of decision-making purposes throughout the company as well. And monetary valuation is not the only option. So yeah, as we were talking about on the last slide, that we have a number of different other options, including quantitative and qualitative valuation.
We highlight that point just because, again, if you think about following the pathway, monetary valuation would be at the top, actually. Realistically speaking, a company, before they even get to a monetary valuation assessment, have gone through a whole process of qualitative and quantitative assessment as well. So we have people discuss around the question of monetary valuation because there's a lot of interest around that, but we also make it quite clear that that's not the only way, and that actually before we get to that, there's a whole process beforehand as well. And that's important to highlight again, to not make them feel discouraged as to how can they even get to that, etc. So that's the reason we highlight that.
Okay, and just to finish off this part by recommending a few immediate next steps. So number one, discuss with your team and other relevant departments. So you can't really do this kind of assessment unless you cooperate with other departments within the business. You can try and do it just as a sustainability team, but if you want to actually make decisions differently as a result of this, if you want to collect all the data that you need from other areas within the business, this is not going to be a particularly effective option. So number one, discuss with other departments with the business and get colleagues on board with this type of process, particularly colleagues from the finance department, colleagues from which is not necessarily always an easy task, but is an important task to manage. And as we were saying, we really see the topic of natural capital and understanding the value to the business of nature and people as being one route for opening some of these doors. Number two, establish a clear objective. As we talked about, there are lots of different objectives to doing this kind of assessment, lots of different use cases. It's important to have the end objective in mind and set up the assessment so that you get information that is useful for making this decision. You set the scope correctly, and that everything that you do is in order to work towards this defined objective. In terms of identifying what business application makes the most sense, here we're looking at the decision that you're trying to inform, who you're trying to target with this information. For example, whether this is customers, investors, how you would talk to CFO and finance department would be very different to how you would talk to kind of local stakeholders. So you need to think about the decision that you're making, the audience for this decision, and this should flow through into the scope of the assessment that you choose, the amount of time and resources that you allocate to it, and the skills that you need to actually carry out the assessment. Katja, is this one back to you?
Sure. No. So then, this is just to then give a bit of appetite if businesses actually they're eager to know more and want to explore getting started with this. Obviously, you can first of all direct them to our training resources page as well. What we see is that there's a lot of sustainability experts within departments that are keen in being able to teach their departments and their company about this. So that can be a helpful resource to them. And then finally, the Natural Capital Coalition also developed not so long ago these training videos that basically carry businesses through a hypothetical example, through each of the different steps of the protocol as to how you would actually conduct an assessment. So that's also very helpful if you want to guide businesses to that resource as well. And again, you have the link on the site.
Okay, so I think that concludes my bit in terms of looking at company case studies, looking at relevant resources, the protocol, the MIT Shift toolkit, and just going over the super basics of measurement and valuation. But of course, I mean, we don't have much time today, but then we do have these resources that are available to learn a little bit more about these topics. And we have module 2 of the training in the works as well, which we'll go into a little bit more detail. So
I can
back to
finish
you.
off
All right,
the
thanks.
training and then the training slide. So then we just go back and think about what the objectives were today and what we really covered. Then we ask the question, as I said in the start, same question, and then usually we see that it goes quite high up, but of course adapt as you wish. Then we'll also make these available. And then after that, we just do a general wrap up of what we covered today, also in more, and what are the key points to take away. So of course, all businesses impact and depend on nature, so it is very important to understand it, what is your relationship with it, to then strengthen your strategy, your business decision making. And applying natural capital approach helps make better and more informed decisions by understanding this holistic value creation. There are many existing tools and resources. So once again, maybe not going back into the devil is in the details, nitty-bitty parts of what do the methodologies look like and the concepts, but really these are available and there's a lot of resources that you can already start with. So companies can start to conduct an assessment themselves. So of course, you guys are consulting companies, so you wish they'll come to you as well with the help with the next steps. But already for the beginning, they have a lot of free tools available for them to start thinking about these. And then, like Matt also talked about a lot, is buy-in must extend beyond the sustainability team. So these are relevant and material to businesses, so it cannot sit siloed in a department, sustainability department, but bring those conversations into risk management, finance, HR, strategy, governance, all of the aspects. Then, of course, with adult learning theory, wrap up is extremely important. So we don't go away just from the day with a whole bunch of bundled ideas, but a little bit looking at also what are the concrete next steps. So what we usually ask, but do feel free to adapt, is on Post-its, take note of 2 learnings that were most useful. So bringing it back to application to yourself. And then 1 concrete next step activity you would take to move your company forward in the natural capital journey. And yesterday, so we did this and we had people write it down on Post-its and then bring them up to a flip chart. Sometimes we even make them voice it out loud, that what is your concrete next step? Sounds silly, but psychologically, it's also really powerful in a way to voice it out. Okay, I'm gonna go and talk with colleagues about this, that, hey, we should be looking at this more. Katja, anything to add on those? Oh yes, the last thing, in the book, on the last page, sometimes as you saw, you also work with your person next to you, so your partner. And sometimes during, especially these full days, you get conversations going. So there is on the final page, I believe, aspects of having kind of this natural capital buddy. So then you can also encourage them to maybe keep in contact with they might be from the same company, but even from different companies to, okay, in 2 months, what have you guys been doing? What kind of challenge have you gone? And maybe steps forward. Yeah.
So we obviously did a lot of talking today. We've talked a lot about how it's important to keep things interactive. In this case, it's a bit different because you're also here to get the needed information to provide the training eventually yourself. But we do have a bit of time to sort of open up the floor and hear from you. First of all, if you would have any questions on any of the part that we've each presented, and also keen to hear any of the suggestions, feedback that you have written down on your post-its. I see some of you have done that, so that's great. So yeah, first of all, is there any questions, clarification questions still needed on the content side of things? No questions this time? I will take that means that we've each done a good job at explaining things as clearly as possible. But again, I'll further emphasize that this is one way that you can do things. That we hope you found some useful tips to you. Most probably what will make most sense to you after this is that you take home everything that you've seen today and again, do some tweaks, adapt to what makes most sense to you. Yeah.
Question, yeah. You said it is a 3-year project. 1 year has gone. That's quite a lot of things we have done already. What is the ambition for the next 2 years? And is there a role for stakeholders as us?
Yes.
In that?
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. Actually, I will have a slide on that. So if you so we can go through it now and then we'll. So yes. So as we've mentioned already before, we're going to start developing the Model 2 training, which in a few months will be available as well. We're also going to be working towards adapting that Module 2 training to be incorporated onto the We by Nature training resources page. So similarly as we did for the Module 1 training, where you can download all of the relevant materials, also according to different timings, that's what we're going to be doing for Module 2 training as well. So eventually that's the next thing that you'll be able to use. Something else that we do on a monthly basis is virtual office hour calls. And there what we do is it's a bit different to a regular webinar format, where typically in a webinar you would have people, experts speaking, and then at the end, if you're lucky enough, you have 10 minutes for questions and answers. What we're trying to do is, and I think that's also where you guys have a role to play, is to really create a sort of group cohesion, some cohorts that are ready to work together, help each other, share resources together on nature-related topics. And so one way that we try and do that is through these virtual office hour calls, where there it's a much more participatory way of engaging with people. So there we have businesses that join these calls, we have consultants, NGOs, all sorts of stakeholders. And the idea is that really we bring in some ideas of topics that we'll discuss, but then we actually open up the floor during the call for everyone to exchange. And what we're seeing is that this is really helping in creating a sort of safe space where all sorts of people together can discuss about this. And linked to that, we've created a LinkedIn group as well, where I'll make sure to invite you guys to as well. And again, with this idea of, obviously training, these kind of things are really important, but essentially what's also essential is that we can, bring businesses together, bring the different stakeholders involved in a sort of safe group where we can discuss about certain topics. So I think that's something where hopefully we can continue having conversations after this training, because I'd be very keen for you guys to participate in some of these elements here. Another thing yeah.
Such a virtual office, how does that work then? It's like it's same infrastructure as a webinar.
Same infrastructure.
People have to register beforehand.
People have to register, exactly. Yeah. But we give very clear, we almost give like homeworks before that people have to prepare for during the call, so that during the call we actually have debates on certain topics, or we have them come back with answers on specific questions we've asked them to work through. So that enables to make it much more of a collaborative process, and we get much more out of participants. And equally, participants also get a lot more out of these kind of calls, as opposed to just a webinar, because they have a chance to actually also voice out some of their questions, some of their challenges, hear from others, and these kind of things. These are calls that are open to anyone, so I would also highly suggest that you participate in that. And actually the best way to be kept informed on some of the activities we're doing is to sign up to our mailing list, which you'll find on our website. But I'm also very happy, if you guys are happy to include you into the invitations for these kind of calls, if you wish.
And what's the topic of the next
So topic of the next call, we're still working on it, but it's very likely going to be around what are the most useful tools and methodologies actually. So that's what we're looking at doing. And typically, again, where you guys could be really, really keen to work with you as well is we're also hoping to use these calls for those that have done train-the-trainers to share their experience. If you've done a training, how has it gone? What has worked less well? If you have any tips that you can share with other people as well on how we can discuss about the topic of nature in a coherent way. And actually, one virtual office hour call that we did was on, we were discussing the debate of how do you explain biodiversity, how do you explain the interlinkages and all of that. So we did a dedicated virtual office hour call on that, and may do another one on that as well. So these are just the kind of topics that you guys can take part in discussions as well, and we'd be keen to have you guys. So train-the-trainer, and then another thing that might be of interest to you guys is we're going to start also this year to do some online training, so self-paced type of online trainings. And the first step will be to actually adapt the module 1 training into a training that's that can be followed online. And this is with the consciousness that not every business or organization has the time to come into in-person training or the resources. So it's also a way to reach out to those audiences and also larger ones beyond just businesses as well. So those are just some of the things that are coming up. And yes, so for those of you that have written down some suggestions that you wish to share, very happy to hear them. If you have general feedback you'd like to share, I'm also very keen to hear. Has this been useful or not? What would you be keen also in seeing in module 2 training that would be helpful to you? So yeah, if anyone wants to share some of that, please, yeah, happy to hear.
I will also encourage you receive now an email from FLIPS where you have a feedback link. It doesn't concern specifically this training on what would you expect from module 1, but you are free to leave any feedback there and we will share the feedback with the ambassadors.
Okay.
I was thinking about what do you expect from us now that we have heard this and are supposed to go out and train our clients in this.
So obviously we're not here to say now you have to go first. That's not the point. The point here is the philosophy really behind the We by Nature campaign is we want to share as much as we can. We also believe that if we want to see change happen within businesses, that also means making useful resources and tools available and freely accessible as well. So that's really the main idea here. It's not to convert you guys to We by Nature trainers. I've managed to do that already with Johanna and Matt, so that I have a team on board now. But obviously, we do hope that you make use of this training. The reason that we're making it so easily and freely accessible is because we hope that you guys will use it. And again, it's with this idea that we're all in this together. So the more of us that are out there sharing what we're doing, sharing our learnings as we're doing this, the better. The more we can also sort of bring other people on board. So that's really the idea. It's really the philosophy of actually making things available and sharing. And then, as I've mentioned before, if you do feel that a lot of the material that you've seen today would be useful to share, whether it's with your colleagues on your team, whether it's with your clients, of course, I'm very happy for you to get in touch with me directly. And if you want to explore how we can help in adapting some of the content or giving further tips if needed, we've had a few people now that have done these trainers that have actually come back saying, hey, actually, I have this amazing opportunity of training the CFOs from my department. Can we have a quick chat and discuss how we can make use of some of this material? Can you give a few tips? So these are also the kind of follow-up things that I'm very happy to do on an individual basis with you guys through email, phone call, or whatever. But yeah, I can only also encourage you guys to take on that role as experts as well in this field to also share these kind of tools and resources with your respective colleagues and yeah. And also through some of the spaces that I've shown to you earlier, whether it's the LinkedIn group that we have, virtual office hour calls, and these kind of things. Does that make sense? Any other reflections, questions?
I have already talked so much. If nobody else has
Yeah.
it's a very good thing that these things get more and more professionalized. I mean, past it was NGOs basically, the 80s and the 90s, almost only ones working on these topics were environmental NGOs and universities maybe. And now this is getting so professional, but now the NGOs are completely out of scope. I don't even see WWF in the consortium, which is strange. Also, is there, it's actually a question for you, what's the role of NGOs as the Finnish nature conservation in this story? Should we profile ourselves? Because we also see outreach and telling and advocacy as our raison d'être, but yeah, I mean, businesses are taking over, which is good because more needs to be done. But does that mean that also the role of NGOs should change? It will be more like, I don't know. Have you been reflected on that during the process? That you are now the NGO, and I don't know. What's my role?
No, I think I mean, it's interesting what you're saying. I think I don't think I have an answer to that really. But what I would say is that what I haven't explained here is that a whole other part of this campaign is actually around building a network of networks. So what we're also trying to do is bring together all kind of different organizations and partners to be involved in this campaign. So you mentioned, for example, WWF. They're one of them that we're quite closely in contact with some of the activities that we're doing. So we're not trying to say now, you know, there's no purpose. I think every type of stakeholder has a purpose, and we actually are trying to bring as many people on board onto this. But yeah, the whole question of creating a network again around this is something that we're trying to build more and more. And we recognize the need also to have conservation organizations involved in that. Actually, we're also going to be doing a training during the IUCN World Conservation Congress, for example, where there as well, we're hoping that we can, you know, collaborate with other partners as well and just get people on board. So we're really also beyond the idea of the philosophy of sharing. Our philosophy is also very much about let's not try and duplicate the work of others and replicate, but rather understand who's doing what and just further emphasize that the respective work that every single people is doing and that's needed in a way. So I don't think that really answers the question, but
and just to add to that, yes, I mean, in this project, a lot across WPC is doing work. We don't do anything in silos. We do collaborate a lot, and that includes a lot of NGOs. We tap into their knowledge. They have such a rich knowledge in many of these aspects, in human rights, in natural capital. So we really bring together businesses and not other networks like NGOs on the same table and talk about the shared goals and actually what are the practical steps then taking that information and going forward with the businesses with that.
But yeah, we are hoping that we can keep in touch with you guys because we recognize that you guys are also doing a lot of amazing work. And again, it's with this idea of what can we share from your work as well? Let's not duplicate. Let's make sure that we're voicing that out. So that's also what we're hoping from you today. Is at the end we can stay in touch and emphasize that as well. So unless there's any other questions or remarks, we're also going to make you do a wrap up, similarly as what we do in our business training. Again, it's important that you also take action. Another thing we've tried to do here is really an emphasis on behavioral change. And as Johanna explained perfectly before, something to emphasize behavioral change is to say what you're going to do next. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do now as well is please write on one post-it the most useful elements from this training to you. And even better, what you may plan on doing with those resources. And then on another, oh, it's the wrong slide, sorry, so ignore what you have here. And on another post-it, mention what's the next concrete action you're going to take after this training going back to your company. So first one is most useful learning and how you may use the resources. Second one is what's the next concrete action you're going to take. So take a few moments for that. And if we have time, I will make you guys voice out what you're going to do to emphasize that you take action. I see that you noticed something about SMEs.
Yeah.
Which is it's a very good point. We're noticing that there's a lot of interest SMEs on this issue actually as well.
The
And
examples are always from huge companies.
Absolutely.
You mentioned this huge
Yes.
power
Yeah.
plant or cement factories. They own land. There are so many
Yeah.
things they can physically do.
Yes.
And then the shopkeeper says, "What does that mean for me?"
Yeah, yeah. No, so it's interesting. We've coming across a lot of organizations, consulting companies that are very keen to know if we're going to be doing something for SMEs. And there's been such an interest that we're actually now discussing in the team if we should try and do some training that's specifically targeted to SMEs. So again, if this is something you guys would be interested in as well, please do get in touch with me because we're kind of keen to explore that a bit further. Yeah. 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 That's a good point, yeah. So that only leaves me to thank you, all of you guys, for your attention today. I hope you appreciate this. A big thank you also to Johanna and Matt and Phil for having us. And yes, please do keep in touch.
Yeah.
I'll follow up with you guys by email actually with further information as well.
Thank you so much. Shall we have a round of applause?